Almost every interview ends the same way. The hiring manager closes the notebook, glances at the clock, and says some version of, "Do you have any questions for us?" The candidate, depending on how it's gone, gives one of a few predictable answers about the team, about the culture, about what success looks like in the role. The manager gives a polished reply. Things wrap, everyone moves on. It feels like a closing courtesy, a formality, a small space tacked on to the end of a more important conversation. That framing is a mistake, and it's one of the most expensive mistakes you can make in a job search. The questions you ask at the end of an interview aren't a courtesy. They're the only part of the whole thing where the power dynamic flips. For the previous 45 minutes, you've been answering, demonstrating, performing competence under conditions someone else designed. In the question phase, that flips. You get to steer the conversation. You get to decide what gets talked about, and you get to pull information out that the company would never volunteer if you didn't ask. Most candidates waste it. They ask things they could have found on the About page. They ask questions designed to flatter the company. They ask questions whose answers don't actually change anything about whether they should take the job. And they leave with a much weaker picture of what they'd be walking into than they could have had if they'd just used the time better. The candidates who use it well do something different. They ask questions designed to surface real information, not impressive sounding ones, not questions that perform interest, questions that produce answers the company would prefer not to give in detail, but can't politely refuse. These reveal the actual texture of the job, the actual nature of the team, and the actual likelihood the role is what it appears to be on paper. The answers often change whether the candidate accepts an offer. Sometimes they change the offer itself because asking the right question signals to the company that the candidate is sharper than they seemed during the rest of the interview, and sharper candidates get treated differently. Here are 10 questions worth asking and the reasoning behind each. Not a checklist to memorize, but a framework for figuring out what kind of information you actually need. Before you say yes, the previous person in the role. Ask, "Can you tell me what happened with the previous person in this role?" Phrasing matters. You're not asking why they left. That's too direct and invites a sanitized answer. You're asking what happened, which is broader and harder to dodge. Answers fall into a few buckets. If they got promoted internally, that's a sign the role is on a real career track. If they left for something better outside, that's neutral and worth probing. If they left under unclear circumstances, or the manager hesitates and gives you a vague reply, that's one of the biggest warning signs you can pick up in an interview. People who leave roles in ways the company doesn't want to describe usually leave for reasons that don't go away when they do. The chair you're being recruited into may be a chair that quietly damages whoever sits in it. 6-month horizon. Ask what would you want to see from someone in this role in their first 6 months, not the first 90 days. That produces rehearsed answers. 6 months. The longer horizon forces a concrete answer instead of a performative one. It tells you how much they've actually thought about the role, what their real priorities are, and whether they have a clear vision or are making it up as they go. A confident, specific answer means a manager who knows what they need. A vague answer about ramping up and learning the team usually means the manager hasn't done the upstream thinking, which usually means the role itself hasn't been defined inside the company. Working for someone who hasn't defined the role is one of the most reliable predictors of being miserable in your first year. How disagreement actually goes. Ask, can you describe a recent moment when you and someone on the team disagreed about an important decision and how it got resolved? This one almost always produces the most useful answer of any question in the interview, because most managers aren't ready for it. The good ones give you a real example with real texture, and you learn how decisions actually get made. The mediocre ones give you a generic answer about open communication and respectful debate, which is the corporate way of saying nothing. The bad ones give you an answer that quietly reveals. A culture of false harmony, disagreement gets suppressed, And the real decisions happen behind closed doors. Texture matters more than content. A manager who can describe a specific recent disagreement is in a healthy team. A manager who can't is usually running a team where disagreement doesn't happen openly, which means it's happening covertly, which means you'll spend your tenure navigating politics instead of work. How promotions actually happen. Ask. When you make a case for someone on your team for a promotion or a raise, what kind of evidence are you looking at? Not how do reviews work. That's the policy answer. The case-making question forces them to describe the real currency of evaluation. Their answer tells you whether advancement is about metrics, visibility, relationships, specific projects, or something else. It also tells you whether your manager actually advocates for their people or treats advancement as something the employee has to drive on their own. Both can be fine to work in, but the strategies are very different, and you need to know which one you're walking into. How the rest of the company sees the team. Ask, how does this team get perceived by the rest of the company? The phrasing is deliberate. You're not asking how they see themselves. You're asking how they look from the outside. It usually produces a real moment of reflection because it forces the manager out of their own bubble. The answer tells you whether the team is respected, whether it's influential, whether it's seen as fast or slow, whether it's a place where careers get built or stall. A team's reputation in the broader org is a strong predictor of how your role will be received internally, and that shapes everything from how seriously your work gets taken to how much budget you can pull. A recent failure. Ask, what's something the team tried? In the last year? That didn't work? Almost no candidates ask this. Most managers, when asked, will answer, sometimes with surprising candor. The value here is what the answer reveals about the team's relationship with failure, which is one of the most diagnostic features of any workplace. A team that can describe a real failure, honestly, is a team that learns. A team that can't, or that hands you a non-answer, is a team that hides failure, which usually means it punishes the people closest to it. The implication for you is direct. In a team that hides failure, your own failures won't be allowed to be small and recoverable. They get hidden until they're career shaping. What resourcing actually looks like. Ask if I joined and needed something to be successful. Headcount, budget, access to a system. What's the realistic process for getting it? Not what's theoretically possible. The realistic process. The answer tells you whether the role is supported or starved. A manager who answers confidently and specifically is leading a team with resources. A manager who hedges, talks about the budgeting calendar, or describes a chain of approvals is leading a team that's constrained. That constraint will get handed down to you. A lot of roles look great in the offer letter and turn out to be operationally impossible because the resources required to do them sit behind processes that take quarters to move through. Tenure on the team. Ask, what does the team look like in terms of who's been here the longest and who joined most recently? This one seems gentle, but produces information that's hard to get otherwise. A team full of long-tenured people is one kind of culture. A team that's almost entirely new is another, and usually points to recent turnover. Recent team-level turnover is a real signal. A manager who describes the tenure pattern openly is usually comfortable with what it shows. A manager who deflects or gets vague usually knows the pattern doesn't flatter them. The manager's own next move. Ask, how long have you been in this role and where do you see yourself going next? If you say it conversationally, it doesn't come across as aggressive. The answer matters because your manager's plans shape your own. 10 years in the same seat with no plans to move means upward mobility is probably limited. The seat above you is occupied indefinitely. 6 months in, and already planning the next move means you may be joining a team that's about to lose its leader, which means you'll be navigating a leadership transition during the period when you're most exposed. The good answer usually sits in between. A manager who has been in the role long enough to have built something, but is thinking about what's next is often the kind of manager who develops successors, which can be very good for you, the hardest part of the job. Ask, what's the part of this role that you think will be most difficult? For whoever takes it, not the most rewarding, not the most interesting, the most difficult. This separates serious candidates from casual ones in the manager's eyes, and it forces an honest answer about the parts of the job the posting didn't describe. Every role has a hard part. Sometimes it's a stakeholder relationship. Sometimes it's a broken system. Sometimes it's a peer team that won't cooperate. Sometimes it's a workload that's just unrealistic. Whatever it is, you need to know before you accept, because that's where most of your energy will go. And if you didn't see it coming, you'll be miserable inside of a few months. These questions work because they shift the conversation from a generic exchange of pleasantries to an actual investigation of what you'd be walking into. They produce information that's otherwise hard to get. They also do something to how the manager sees you. Candidates who ask substantive questions tend to come across as more serious, more senior, and more thoughtful than candidates who ask the standard ones. That perception matters in the offer phase. Companies tend to invest more financially and otherwise. In candidates they read as sharp, the questions you ask are one of the strongest signals of that you can send. One more thing worth saying about the question phase. The information you collect isn't only for the accept or decline decision. It's also for the negotiation if you negotiate. A lot of candidates negotiate on comp alone. The smarter move is to negotiate on the things you actually learned. If you learned the team has resource constraints, negotiate for an explicit budget commitment for your function. If you learned there's a difficult stakeholder relationship, negotiate for executive sponsorship, a regular check-in with someone senior. If turnover has been high, negotiate a retention component that protects you early. None of that is possible if you didn't collect the information first. The question phase is what makes the negotiation phase strategic instead of purely financial. There's a discipline that goes with this approach too. Don't ask all 10 questions in one interview. Don't even ask most of them. Pick the 3 or 4 most important, based on what you already know about the role and the company. Save the rest for later rounds. Conversations with peers on the team, and the final round meetings with senior leaders. Spreading the questions across people lets you triangulate. You can ask the same question of different people and compare answers. Discrepancies between answers are themselves information. If the hiring manager describes the team one way and a senior leader describes it another, you've just learned something neither of them said out loud. The point under all of this is that interviews get framed as a process where the company evaluates the candidate. That framing is half wrong. A real interview is also where the candidate evaluates the company. Most candidates don't do that half well because they're nervous, because they've been trained to perform instead of investigate, and because they treat the question phase as a closing courtesy. It isn't a courtesy from your side of the table. It's the most important part of the conversation. The questions you ask determine the quality of the information you'll have. When you decide whether to say yes, and saying yes to a role is one of the more consequential decisions you'll make about the next year of your life. So ask the ones that produce real answers. Pay attention to the texture as much as the content, and remember that the manager is being interviewed too, even if they don't realize it, and the questions you ask are how that interview gets conducted.